Spring, 1941. Britain stands alone. On the surface, the island nation appears defiant. Fighter planes have survived the Battle of Britain. London still burns at night, but it has not fallen. Yet far from the public eye, beyond the cliffs of Dover and the bombed streets of Liverpool, another battle is being fought in the cold, black waters of the Atlantic, and Britain is losing. Every day, slow merchant convoys leave North America carrying the lifeblood of a nation at war. Grain, oil, ammunition, aircraft parts, trucks, medicine. Without these supplies, Britain cannot feed its people, it cannot arm its soldiers, it cannot survive. The Atlantic Ocean is not just water, it is a supply artery stretching 3,000 miles. If that artery is severed, Britain bleeds out. Waiting beneath the waves are the submarines of Nazi Germany. Under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, German U-boats operate in coordinated wolf packs. When one submarine spots a convoy, it does not attack immediately. It radios the location back to headquarters. Then, silently, other U-boats converge. At night, they surface and strike in groups, launching torpedoes into the slow, crowded merchant ships. Flames erupt, tankers explode, cargo vessels break in half, sailors plunge into freezing water that kills within minutes. By 1941, the numbers are staggering. Hundreds of Allied ships have already been sunk. In some months, losses exceed 300,000 tons of shipping. Britain is losing vessels faster than they can be built. Insurance rates skyrocket. Merchant sailors face casualty rates higher than many frontline soldiers. And unlike soldiers, most of them are civilians. The escorts protecting these convoys, destroyers and corvettes, are doing everything they can. Their primary anti-submarine weapon is depth charge. It is essentially a large barrel of explosives rolled off the back of a ship. The charge sinks to a preset depth and detonates, sending a violent underwater shock wave outward. In theory, it should work. In practice, it rarely does. To use depth charges, an escort ship must pass directly over a submerged submarine. The ship relies on early sonar technology known as ASDIC. ASDIC sends out a pulse of sound underwater. If the sound hits a solid object like a submarine hull, it echoes back. The operator hears a ping and estimates distance and direction. But here is the fatal flaw. The moment the attacking ship moves over the submarine to drop depth charges, it loses sonar contact. The target disappears beneath the ship's blind spot. The crew guesses where the submarine might be and releases a pattern of explosives into the sea. Sometimes the explosions are close enough to cause damage. Often they are not. Statistics from the early years of the war reveal a brutal reality. On average, it takes around 60 depth charge attacks to sink a single U-boat. 60. Each attack consumes time, fuel, and munitions. Each failed attack allows the submarine to slip away, reload, and hunt again. Meanwhile, the convoy remains exposed. The physics of underwater warfare favor the hunter beneath the surface. A submarine is small, quiet, and difficult to detect. The ocean is vast and absorbs sound unpredictably. Thermal layers bend sonar waves. Storms distort signals. Even when ASDIC works perfectly, it only detects submarines underwater. At night, U-boats often travel on the surface, where they are faster and harder to distinguish from the waves. The escorts are outnumbered and overstretched. Britain entered the war with too few destroyers. Many were lost during the evacuation at Dunkirk. New ships are being built, but not fast enough. Convoys sometimes sail with minimal protection across thousands of open ocean. Every sinking is a disaster measured not only in steel and cargo, but in human lives. Survivors describe oil-covered seas set on fire by burning tankers. They describe clinging to debris in near-freezing water. In the North Atlantic, a man without a lifeboat may have 10 minutes before hypothermia sets in. Rescue is not always possible. Escort ships cannot stop for long without risking the entire convoy. By early 1941, the British position is precarious. Prime Minister Churchill later writes that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, but the slow strangling of his nation by submarines. Shipping losses are approaching critical levels. If they continue at this rate, Britain may be forced to negotiate. Food rationing tightens. Civilian morale is strained. Factories depend on imported raw materials. Even American aid flowing under Lend-Lease must cross the same deadly waters. Churchill demands solutions. He pressures the Admiralty. He urges scientists and engineers to find new weapons, new tactics, anything that can turn the tide. Radar is improving. Air patrols are expanding. But in 1941, the gap in the mid-Atlantic, beyond the range of land-based aircraft, remains a killing ground. It is not courage. Escort crews fight relentlessly. Convoys adapt formations. Intelligence services begin to crack German codes. Yet technology lags behind the threat. The U-boat commanders believe victory is within reach. Dönitz calculates that if Germany can maintain a fleet of roughly 300 operational submarines, they can sink shipping faster than Britain and America can replace it. In 1941, he is getting closer to that number. Each torpedo fired is not just an attack on a ship, it is an attack on Britain's ability to continue the war. In the gray waters between Newfoundland and Ireland, the future of Europe hangs on tonnage statistics and sonar echoes. By the spring of 1941, the message is clear. The current methods are not enough. Depth charges are too imprecise. Sonar contact is too fragile. Convoys are too vulnerable. If nothing changes, the Atlantic will become a graveyard, not only for ships, but for the Allied war effort itself. Britain does not yet know it, but somewhere within its own scientific community is a stubborn chemist who believes the problem is not unsolvable, only unsolved, and the clock is ticking.
He was not an admiral. He did not command fleets. He did not wear rows of medals earned at sea. He was a chemist. Charles Goodeve was born far from salt water and warships in the wide-open landscapes of Manitoba, Canada. There were no oceans there, no destroyers cutting through gray Atlantic swells. But there was something else, a restless curiosity and a stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done. By the time the Second World War erupted, Goodeve was already an accomplished scientist. Trained in chemistry, precise in thought, methodical in approach, he possessed the kind of analytical mind that war increasingly demanded. When Britain mobilized its scientific community, he joined the Admiralty's research establishment, tasked with solving practical problems for a navy under immense pressure. At first glance, he seemed an unlikely revolutionary. He was not flamboyant, not political, not a self-promoter, but he had something far more dangerous inside the rigid machinery of wartime bureaucracy. He questioned assumptions. By 1940, the Royal Navy faced a crisis in anti-submarine warfare. Escort commanders were brave and experienced, yet they were fighting with tools that belonged to another era. Depth charges remained the primary weapon against U-boats, and as the losses mounted, Goodeve began studying the data. Scientists approach war differently than admirals. Admirals see ships and tactics. Scientists see patterns. Goodeve examined attack reports. He calculated probabilities. He reviewed after-action summaries from convoy escorts. The numbers told a grim story. Dozens of depth charge patterns were being dropped for every confirmed submarine kill. Ships were expending enormous amounts of explosives for minimal results. The problem, he realized, was not simply explosive power, it was geometry. A destroyer had to pass directly over a submerged submarine to release depth charges. The moment it did, sonar contact vanished. The attacker lost sight of the target at the most critical instant. It was like trying to hit a moving animal in the dark and closing your eyes just before pulling the trigger. Worse still, depth charges relied on pressure waves. They did not need a direct hit. They needed to detonate close enough to rupture a submarine's hull. But underwater shock waves dissipate unpredictably. A few meters could mean the difference between destruction and escape. The result was waste, and in 1941, Britain could not afford waste. Goodeve began exploring an idea that had surfaced and been rejected multiple times over the previous decades: a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon. Instead of dropping explosives behind a ship, why not fire them ahead of the vessel while sonar contact was still intact? On paper, the idea sounded simple. In practice, the Admiralty had dismissed it repeatedly. The technical challenges were significant: timing, fusing mechanisms, accuracy, recoil, deck space. Every proposal had been deemed impractical, unnecessary, or too complicated. Some officials believed depth charges were sufficient if used properly. Others doubted the reliability of contact fuses underwater. There was institutional inertia at work. The Royal Navy had traditions, procedures, hierarchies. New weapons required committees, approvals, budgets, manufacturing capacity, and Britain was already fighting for survival. Goodeve did not see impossibility, he saw inefficiency. He refined the concept in his mind. If a ship could launch multiple small bombs ahead in a pattern, and if those bombs detonated only on direct contact with a submarine hull, several advantages would emerge. First, sonar contact would be maintained during the attack. Second, there would be no massive underwater explosion unless a hit was achieved, meaning a miss would not obscure sonar readings with shockwave interference. Third, the psychological pressure on submarine crews would intensify. They would hear projectiles entering the water around them, knowing that a single touch could be fatal. But convincing the Admiralty was another matter. The British naval bureaucracy during wartime was both disciplined and cautious. Resources were limited, factories were stretched. Every new idea competed with aircraft production, radar development, shipbuilding schedules. Senior officers were reluctant to divert attention from proven methods, even if those methods were underperforming. Goodeve pushed forward anyway. He built models, he ran calculations, he worked with engineers to experiment with spigot mortars, simple launching devices that could fire projectiles without heavy recoil systems. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Dozens of small contact-fused bombs launched in an arc, falling into the sea ahead of the ship in a circular pattern. Still, resistance persisted. At one point, a senior official reportedly suggested that even God Almighty himself could not get such a device approved. It was not necessarily hostility, it was skepticism hardened by decades of naval tradition. Goodeve's personality now became decisive. He was not loud, but he was relentless. He understood that data alone would not win the argument. Demonstration would. He gathered evidence from convoy reports. He highlighted the inefficiency ratios. He framed the proposal not as an experimental luxury, but as a wartime necessity. Britain, he argued, implicitly through his work, could not continue trading 60 attacks for one submarine. The war did not pause for committee debates. Merchant ships continued to sink.
Escort crews continued to exhaust themselves in fruitless hunts. Somewhere in the Atlantic, another convoy was forming, and another wolf pack was receiving orders. Goodeve believed the solution was within reach, not through bigger explosions, but smarter ones. In the spring of 1941, with Churchill demanding results and the Admiralty under pressure, the atmosphere began to shift. Desperation has a way of loosening resistance to innovation. The chemist from Manitoba was about to force an old Navy to reconsider what it thought was impossible. He was not fighting U-boats yet. He was fighting doubt.
By 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a contest of mathematics as much as courage. Every convoy escort captain knew the routine: detect, pursue, lose contact, drop depth charges, hope for the best. And too often, hope was all they had. Charles Goodeve believed the flaw was not in the bravery of the crews or even in the power of the explosives. The flaw was in the sequence of attack itself. A submarine detected by ASDIC could be tracked with reasonable accuracy, as long as the escort ship kept its distance. The moment the destroyer steamed directly over the target to release depth charges, sonar contact disappeared. The submarine slipped into a blind zone beneath the hull. From that point on, everything depended on estimation. The attacking ship guessed speed, guessed heading, guessed depth. War is unforgiving to guesswork. Goodeve began rethinking the problem from first principles. What if the attacking ship never had to pass over the submarine at all? What if it could strike while maintaining continuous sonar contact? That single change would transform the geometry of the engagement. The answer lay not in dropping explosives behind the ship, but in throwing them forward. Forward-throwing weapons were not entirely new concepts. Variations had been proposed as far back as the First World War, but they had been dismissed as impractical. The Royal Navy favored large depth charges, heavy, powerful, simple devices that required no precision fusing. Smaller, contact-fused bombs were viewed with suspicion. What if they detonated prematurely? What if they failed to explode at all? What if they proved too complicated for wartime production? Goodeve examined these objections carefully. He understood that any new weapon would need to be mechanically simple, rugged, and cheap to manufacture in large quantities. The breakthrough came with the use of spigot mortars, relatively simple launching tubes that used a fixed rod or spigot instead of a traditional barrel. This design reduced recoil dramatically and allowed multiple projectiles to be fired simultaneously from a compact platform mounted on a ship's deck. Instead of a single massive explosion underwater, Goodeve envisioned a pattern of dozens of small bombs launched in a circular spread ahead of the ship. Each projectile would sink rapidly. Each would carry a contact fuse designed only if it struck the metal hull of a submarine. If none of them made contact, there would be no explosion. That detail was crucial. With depth charges, even a miss produced a violent underwater detonation that disrupted sonar readings and forced the escort to reacquire the target. With the new system, silence meant failure, but it also meant the sonar operator could continue tracking the submarine immediately, preparing for another attack run without losing valuable seconds. The first prototypes were crude. Early trials revealed problems with consistency and timing. Engineers wrestled with fuse sensitivity. Too sensitive and accidental detonation could endanger the attacking ship. Not sensitive enough, and a direct hit might fail to explode. There were also practical naval concerns. Deck crews would need to reload quickly under combat conditions. The weapon system had to be stable in rough seas. Ammunition storage needed to be safe. Every component had to function reliably in salt water, wind, and freezing spray. The testing process was iterative.
Failures were analyzed, modified, retested. Goodeve applied the scientific method relentlessly: hypothesis, experiment, adjustment. Skepticism within the Admiralty did not vanish overnight. Some officers argued that contact fuses were inherently unreliable. Others doubted whether smaller explosives could inflict sufficient damage to a pressure hull designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean. But calculations suggested otherwise. A direct contact detonation against a submarine's hull would concentrate force precisely where it mattered. Instead of relying on shock waves from nearby explosions, this new weapon would deliver energy at the point of impact. The pattern was key, too. Rather than relying on one or two large charges, the forward-throwing system would launch a cluster, eventually standardized at 24 projectiles, arranged to fall in a circular formation roughly 40 meters across. A submarine caught within that pattern faced multiple lethal possibilities. During sea trials, results began to speak louder than objections. The Hedgehog demonstrated that it could maintain sonar contact during attack runs. Crews reported improved tracking continuity. The psychological effect was notable as well. Unlike depth charges, which exploded with thunderous violence even when they missed, the new system created tense silence. If there was no explosion, the submarine crew knew they had narrowly escaped. If there was an explosion, it meant a direct hit. That weapon would soon be received an official name: Hedgehog, a reference to the spines of projectiles projecting outward from its launcher. It looked unconventional. A cluster of angled rods mounted on the foredeck did not resemble traditional naval artillery, but appearance mattered less than performance. By late 1941 and into 1942, the Hedgehog began entering operational service. Escort crews required training, sonar operators had to coordinate more precisely with gunnery teams, attack procedures were rewritten. The geometry of anti-submarine warfare shifted. Instead of charging blindly over a submerged enemy, a destroyer could now approach, maintain contact, fire ahead, and immediately assess results without losing track. The statistics would eventually confirm what Goodeve had predicted. The number of attacks required per submarine dropped dramatically compared to depth charges alone. Where dozens of explosive runs had once been necessary, successful engagements could now occur in a fraction of the attempts. But in these early days, none of that was guaranteed. The Hedgehog was still unproven in full combat conditions. U-boats remained deadly. The Atlantic remained vast and unforgiving. Production had to scale rapidly. Manufacturing lines were established across Britain and later in the United States. Standardization ensured compatibility with Allied escort ships. What had once been dismissed as impossible was now bolted onto the decks of warships crossing the Atlantic. Charles Goodeve had not eliminated submarines, he had changed the rules of engagement. And in a war where small margins determined survival, changing the geometry of attack might be enough to tip the balance beneath the waves.
When the Hedgehog first went to sea, there was no guarantee it would change the war. New weapons often promised more than they delivered. The Atlantic had swallowed confidence before. Escort crews were trained quickly. Sonar operators adjusted to a new rhythm: track steadily, close carefully, fire before contact was lost. Gunnery teams learned to prepare the launcher: 24 small projectiles angled outward like quills. Each round weighed roughly 65 pounds, far lighter than a traditional depth charge, but deadly if it struck steel. The first operational uses were cautious. Commanders did not immediately abandon depth charges. Instead, they integrated the Hedgehog into layered attack patterns. But something became clear almost immediately. The engagement felt different. With depth charges, an attack was violent chaos. The escort would roar overhead, drop its explosives, and brace as massive underwater detonations rocked the hull. Sonar contact vanished in the turbulence. Minutes passed before reacquisition, if reacquisition happened at all. With the Hedgehog, there was tension and then silence. A destroyer would approach, sonar echo steady in the operator's headphones. Range decreasing, bearing steady. At the calculated moment, the launcher fired. The projectiles arced forward and splashed into the sea ahead of the ship. Then everyone waited. If nothing happened, the sea remained eerily quiet. No thunderous explosions, no concussion waves, just the steady hum of engines and the sonar operator still tracking the target. The ship could adjust course and fire again almost immediately. But if even one projectile made contact with a submarine's hull, the result was unmistakable. A sharp, contained underwater explosion, often followed by debris, oil, or air bubbles rising to the surface. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. For U-boat crews, depth charges were terrifying but imprecise. They could endure dozens of near misses and still survive. But the Hedgehog introduced a new danger: silent, invisible projectiles descending directly toward them, detonating only on impact. There was no warning blast pattern to gauge distance. Either the submarine was untouched or it was fatally struck. As 1942 turned into 1943, the Atlantic War reached its decisive phase. German U-boat numbers peaked. Admiral Dönitz deployed submarines aggressively, hoping to sever Allied supply lines before American industrial power could fully mobilize. But Allied technology was advancing just as rapidly. Long-range patrol aircraft began closing the mid-Atlantic air gap. Radar improved detection of surfaced submarines at night. Intelligence breakthroughs from code-breaking operations provided strategic insights into Wolfpack deployments. And on the escort decks, the Hedgehog added precision to persistence. The statistics began to shift. Where early war escorts had required on average around 60 depth charge attacks to achieve a confirmed kill, Hedgehog-equipped ships saw dramatic improvements. The number of attacks per successful sinking dropped sharply. Contact was maintained. Follow-up strikes were faster. Ammunition was used more efficiently. Convoy survival rates improved. One of the most striking demonstrations of the weapon's potential came not in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific. In May 1944, the American destroyer escort USS England encountered a series of Japanese submarines operating in the Solomon Islands region. Over a span of just 12 days, the ship used its Hedgehog system in coordinated attacks to sink 6 submarines, an unprecedented record in naval history. Each engagement followed the same disciplined pattern: sonar contact maintained, calculated approach, forward launch, confirmation through explosion or debris. The record stood unmatched. By then, the Battle of the Atlantic had already begun to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. In May 1943 alone, German U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels. Dozens were destroyed in a single month. Dönitz was forced to withdraw many of his submarines from the North Atlantic hunting grounds. The shift was not due to one invention alone. Air cover, radar, improved convoy tactics, and intelligence all played critical roles, but the Hedgehog filled a crucial tactical gap. It transformed the final moments of contact between hunter and hunted. For escort crews who once felt nearly powerless after losing sonar contact, the new weapon restored initiative. They no longer had to gamble on blind drops. They could strike with calculation. Merchant sailors began to notice the difference indirectly.
Convoys that once expected losses now crossed with fewer sinkings. Insurance rates stabilized. Tonnage statistics, once grim reading in admiralty reports, began to improve. The Atlantic did not become safe overnight. Submarines remained lethal adversaries. Storms still scattered convoys. Torpedoes still struck without warning, but the balance had shifted. German submarine commanders reported increasingly dangerous conditions. Allied escorts were more aggressive, more coordinated, more accurate. The margin for survival narrowed. A single tracking error could mean destruction. By late 1943, it was evident that Germany had lost the initiative in the Atlantic. The campaign that had once threatened to starve Britain into submission was now draining German resources at unsustainable rates. For Charles Goodeve, the transformation was not celebrated with parades. Scientists rarely receive battlefield headlines. Yet his insistence on rethinking a flawed sequence, on changing the geometry of attack, had altered thousands of engagements across 2 oceans. The Hedgehog did not roar like heavy artillery. It did not produce cinematic explosions unless it succeeded. Its power lay in precision, repetition, and relentless pressure. In the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic, where supply ships once sailed in fear of unseen predators, the odds were no longer so one-sided. The weapon that had been called impossible was now mounted on the bows of Allied warships around the world, and beneath the waves, the hunters were becoming the hunted.
Victory in the Atlantic did not arrive with a single announcement. There was no dramatic surrender ceremony beneath the waves. Instead, it emerged slowly in statistics, in shipping reports, in the growing confidence of convoy commanders who began to believe they would reach their destinations. By late 1943 and into 1944, the numbers told a different story than they had 2 years earlier. Allied ship production outpaced losses. German U-boat sinkings climbed sharply. Admiral Karl Donitz, once confident that submarines could strangle Britain into submission, was forced to acknowledge that the tide had turned. The Battle of the Atlantic had been the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. It stretched from the first day of hostilities in 1939 to the final surrender in 1945. More than 3,500 Allied merchant ships were lost. Tens of thousands of sailors died. German U-boat crews suffered catastrophic casualties. Nearly 3/4 of them would not survive the war. It was a brutal contest of endurance and innovation. The Hedgehog was not the sole reason for Allied victory. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Radar improved night detection. High-frequency direction finding located enemy transmissions. Codebreakers deciphered encrypted communications. Shipyards in the United States produced Liberty ships at astonishing speed. But technology works as a system, and within that system, the Hedgehog solved a specific, crippling flaw in anti-submarine tactics. It allowed escorts to maintain contact at the decisive moment. It reduced wasted attacks. It multiplied the effectiveness of limited ships and crews. Where once it had taken an average of 60 depth-charge attacks to sink a submarine, the introduction of forward-throwing contact weapons reduced that number dramatically. Each successful engagement meant one less predator stalking convoys. Each improvement in efficiency translated into saved ships, saved cargo, saved lives. It is impossible to calculate precisely how many sailors survived because of that change in geometry, but the impact echoed outward. Food reached Britain's ports, fuel powered factories and fleets. American troops crossed the Atlantic in preparation for the invasion of Europe.
The D-Day landings themselves depended on secure supply lines, lines that would have been impossible to maintain had the U-boats retained dominance. In that sense, the struggle beneath the Atlantic surface shaped the outcome of the war on land. And yet, Charles Goodeve did not become a household name. After the war, he was recognized within scientific and naval circles. He was knighted for his contributions and continued a distinguished career in research and administration. But public memory tends to focus on battlefield generals and dramatic offensives, not on engineers refining fuse mechanisms in laboratories. His story is quieter, but no less consequential. He fought two enemies at once, the external threat of German submarines and the internal resistance of institutional doubt. The Royal Navy was not uniquely stubborn. Large organizations in wartime must be cautious. Resources are finite. Mistakes are costly. Yet innovation often requires someone willing to challenge established procedures. Goodeve's persistence illustrates a broader truth about modern warfare. By the Second World War, victory depended not only on courage and numbers, but on the integration of science into strategy. Laboratories became as vital as shipyards. Equations mattered as much as artillery. The Hedgehog also influenced future anti-submarine development. Its core principle, forward-thrown, contact-based attack while maintaining sensor tracking, informed later systems and guided post-war naval design. Anti-submarine warfare would continue evolving through guided torpedoes, improved sonar arrays, and rocket-assisted weapons, but the conceptual leap had already been made. Instead of accepting the blind spot as inevitable, Goodeve asked a simple question: why attack in a way that forces you to lose sight of the enemy? That question reshaped tactics across two oceans. There is an irony in the name Hedgehog. The small animal survives not through speed or size, but through defense, through spines that deter predators. The naval hedgehog reversed that symbolism. It gave the hunted convoys a new set of spines, projecting outward from the bows of their escorts. In 1941, Britain faced the real possibility of starvation and strategic collapse. Shipping losses threatened national survival. Churchill later admitted that the U-boat peril was the one danger that truly alarmed him. The Atlantic was a battlefield without front lines, without visible victories, only monthly tonnage reports measuring hope or despair. The turnaround did not happen overnight. It required industry, intelligence, cooperation between nations, but it also required individuals willing to refuse the word impossible. From a prairie town in Manitoba to the Admiralty's research offices, Charles Goodeve carried that refusal with him. He did not command fleets, yet his work empowered thousands of sailors. He did not fire torpedoes, yet his invention silenced many of them. History often celebrates decisive battles: Stalingrad, Midway, Normandy. Yet behind those names are supply lines, and behind supply lines are oceans. And beneath those oceans, in the cold darkness of the Atlantic, the outcome of the war was being calculated in sonar echoes and steel hulls. One chemist looked at a flawed pattern of attack and chose to redesign it. The result was not just a new weapon, but a shift in momentum, a quiet turning of the tide. And sometimes, in war as in science, that is enough to change the world.